the blood drinker. Have you ever had something kill what you love most and been completely powerless to stop it? Have you looked into inhuman eyes and known, without doubt, that you were seeing something that shouldn't exist in our world? I have, and that memory has haunted me for nearly 30 years. The first time I saw the Chupacabra, though I didn't know to call it that then, I was 12 years old. It happened during a dry autumn in 1993 in the Blue Ridge foothills of the Shenandoah Valley. My father had taken me on my first deer hunting trip, a rite of passage I'd been looking forward to for years. Max came with us, a magnificent black and tan blue-tick coonhound, lean and smart, the best tracking dog in our county. He'd been by my side since I was 7, and I couldn't imagine a hunting trip without him. "Tonight, you become a hunter," my father told me as we set up camp, his face filled with pride. The same words his father had spoken to him decades earlier. We didn't use hunting blinds or tree stands. Our method was simple: find a good vantage point, be patient, and let Max track once we'd wounded our prey. We settled against a rocky outcropping that overlooked a small watering hole where deer would come to drink at dusk, just as my father had explained. The light was nearly gone when Max began to growl. "Quiet," my father whispered, but Max continued, looking agitated. This wasn't his usual alertness when spotting game. This was different. Even at that age, I could tell something was wrong. My father frowned, scanning the area. "I don't like this," he said softly. The growling stopped abruptly, and Max's ears perked up. He stared intently at the opposite side of the watering hole, where the brush was thick. Then, without warning, he bolted from our side, racing toward whatever he sensed. "Max, no!" I cried out, but it was too late. He disappeared into the darkness. My father grabbed my arm as I started to run after him. "Stay here," he commanded. He reached for his flashlight, but before he could turn it on, we heard Max's frantic barking followed by a sound I'll never forget, something between a growl and a hiss, with a rattling quality that still echoes in my nightmares. Then came a yelp of pain from Max and the sounds of a struggle. My father switched on the flashlight, sweeping its beam toward the commotion. For a brief moment, the light illuminated the scene across the watering hole. There was something hunched over Max, its back to us. The creature was hairless with grayish-green skin that glistened wetly in the light. Its spine protruded sharply, each vertebra visible through the taut skin. What I remember most clearly were the spines, not fur, but actual quill-like projections running down its back. It turned its head toward our light, and I saw its eyes, large, round, and reflective like a cat's, but with no humanity in them. I didn't see a mouth, but Max's black and tan coat was dark and wet with blood. My father fumbled for his rifle, then screamed at me to run. I couldn't move. My father had to grab me by the collar and drag me backward. Only then did my legs remember how to work. I'll never forget running through the dark Appalachian night, so scared and yet so angry that something had hurt my dog. We didn't stop until we reached the truck. My father practically threw me into the passenger seat. "What was that?" I asked, over and over, my voice shaking. Finally, he whispered, "El Chupacabra." I'd heard whispered stories about the Chupacabra. In our region of Virginia, with its growing Hispanic community, these tales had spread from Puerto Rico and Mexico, intermingling with older Appalachian folklore. But they were supposed to be just stories to frighten kids into coming home before dark, to get folks to look after their livestock better. "We have to go back for Max," I pleaded. My father shook his head grimly. "Max is gone. There won't be anything left for us to find out there." When we got home, my father told my mother we had lost Max to a mountain lion. He never spoke of what we really saw, not to anyone. In the months that followed, when others in the county reported livestock drained of blood, he would leave the room. It's been decades since then. I've had other dogs, but I've never taken another dog hunting, and though I still hunt occasionally, I'm always back in my vehicle before sunset. The image of that creature hunched over Max's body still haunts me. My father went to his grave, never publicly acknowledging what we saw that night. But I know what took Max from us, and it wasn't any mountain lion. The Blue Ridge Mountains are ancient, over 1 billion years old. The valleys and hollows hide countless secrets. The natives who lived here for thousands of years before European settlers arrived had stories of spirits and creatures that defied explanation. Perhaps some of those legends were based on truth. Last year, I took my own son on his first hunt in those same mountains. We stayed far from that watering hole, and we were packed up well before dusk. As we were leaving, he asked why we had to go so early when we could have stayed longer. I simply told him, some things in these mountains only come out at night. And trust me, you don't want to meet them. What would you do if you came face to face with something that science says shouldn't exist? Would you tell your story, knowing most would think you're crazy? Or would you keep the secret, knowing that sometimes ignorance truly is bliss? The metallic collar. What would you do if you discovered something buried beneath the earth that shouldn't be there? Something that challenges everything you thought you knew about these mountains and what might live within them. Would you keep digging or seal it back up and run? I've lived and hunted my entire life in the Cumberland Plateau region of eastern Kentucky, on land that's been in my family since before the Civil War. The Appalachians are in my blood. Every hollow, ridge, and cave feels like home to me. My grandfather taught me everything about tracking, patience, and respecting the woods. He also stressed that the land had secrets older than any of us, things that couldn't be explained by logic or reason. I'd always brushed off those superstitions as folklore passed down through generations, meant to keep children from wandering too far. Growing up, I often heard about the lights people sometimes saw in the woods, little flickers that would vanish if you tried to approach. My grandfather swore he'd seen them more than once. Pale blue lights bobbing silently through the trees, always near a steep ravine at the edge of our property. He warned me never to venture close to that ravine, recounting tales of hunters and hikers who'd vanished without a trace. I respected his wishes mostly out of love for him rather than belief in his stories. But something happened during deer season last year that's left me questioning everything I've ever known about these mountains. The morning was colder than usual, late October, with the leaves mostly fallen, covering the forest floor in noisy layers. I reached my tree stand just before sunrise, bundled in heavy gear with my grandfather's old Winchester rifle. Normally, I feel at peace up there, watching the woods wake up. That day was different from the start. An hour or two passed quietly, just bird songs and squirrels making their rounds. But around mid-morning, everything went eerily quiet. No birds, no wind, not even distant traffic from the county road. It was as if the world had suddenly hit mute. I shivered, figuring maybe a predator had spooked everything silent. That's when I heard a sound I'll never forget, a distant metallic clang, like someone striking an old church bell far off through the trees. The sound echoed, unnatural and hollow, and it immediately felt wrong. There's nothing like that anywhere near here. No old structures, no metal towers, nothing that could make such a sound. Curiosity got the better of me. I climbed down quietly and decided to follow the direction of the noise, carefully picking my way through thick shrubs and tangled growth, stepping slowly to keep my presence hidden. After a few minutes, the metallic ringing came again, this time closer, clearer, and strangely rhythmic, almost like a deliberate call and response. I moved cautiously toward the ravine my grandfather had always warned me about, despite my better judgment. As I reached the edge, I noticed a faint glint down in the gully, like sunlight reflecting off something shiny. Peering over the edge, my heart dropped. There, only partially buried in moss and leaves, was an enormous metal ring, like a wheel or a hatch embedded in the earth. It looked rusted and ancient, nothing I'd ever seen before, about 10 feet across and half hidden by decades of forest growth. What made me freeze was the fresh dirt around it, clearly disturbed, as if something had recently emerged. As I stared, another metallic clang sounded, this time directly beneath me. The ground vibrated subtly under my feet. I scrambled backward, heart racing. Then I heard a low clicking, almost mechanical, but somehow organic. I froze, crouched behind a tree, barely breathing, eyes fixed on the rusted hatch. Slowly, something emerged. I had no idea what to expect. Maybe a person, some mysterious old survivalist using an abandoned bunker. But what rose from that hatch defied explanation. Its body was covered in segmented plates, almost insect-like, reflecting faintly in the sunlight. Its limbs ended in strange clawed appendages, and its head was small, featureless, and oval. It moved with jerky, twitchy motions, testing the air as if sensing something. Could it sense me? My chest tightened at the thought. I stayed completely still, praying it wouldn't detect me. After a few agonizing moments, it retreated slowly back toward the hatch, making that disturbing, clicking noise until it disappeared below ground. I didn't wait another second. I bolted through the trees, not caring about noise or stealth, racing home as fast as I could. When I stumbled into our kitchen, pale and shaking, my father instantly knew something was wrong. He listened silently as I described what I'd seen. He didn't doubt me. Instead, he quietly admitted he'd seen lights in that ravine as a teenager, but had never gotten close enough to see more. He told me his father, my grandfather, had always believed something unnatural was buried deep beneath our land, something better left undisturbed. A week later, my cousin Jake visited, and after hearing my story repeatedly, he asked me to show him the hatch. Excitement beat out my fear, so I agreed. But as we made our way to the spot where I swear the hatch had been, we found nothing. The surrounding area didn't match my memory either. It was impossible. The landmark trees, the rock formations, all seemed shifted somehow. To this day, I believe I didn't misremember the location. I think whatever is down there doesn't want to be found again. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that metallic clanging carried on the wind from the direction of the ravine. The Appalachians are among the oldest mountains on Earth. Who knows what secrets they've kept hidden for millions of years? What if those stories about things living beneath the Cumberland Plateau weren't just tall tales told around campfires? Now, whenever I hear those stories of strange lights or unexplained disappearances whispered around town, I find myself listening a little closer, no longer dismissing them so easily. Have you ever heard something impossible in the woods? Something that makes you question whether you're alone out there? And worse, have you ever felt like something ancient and unknowable was watching you from beneath the very ground you walk on? The woman in red. Have you ever seen something that vanishes when you try to approach it? Something that leaves no trace behind. No footprints, no disturbance, nothing to prove it was ever there. I have, and the experience has left me wondering whether some spirits are bound to wander the places where they were lost. I've spent most of my life in the woods of the Allegheny Mountains in Pennsylvania, a stretch of rugged terrain my father always said could swallow a man whole if he wasn't careful. The dense forests and steep, unpredictable landscapes have confused even experienced hunters, which explains the occasional missing person posters that appear taped to utility poles each season. My family always took safety seriously, never venturing out alone, always sticking to the trails we knew by heart. 2 years ago, during rifle season for deer, something happened that I've kept mostly quiet about until now. It started on a gray afternoon in November when the air felt heavy with incoming snow. My brother Jason and I were up in separate tree stands about a half-mile apart, keeping an eye out for deer. I've been sitting there since dawn when I spotted something moving through the trees across a clearing about 100 yards away. My first thought was another hunter, though it seemed odd since no one else had permission to hunt our land. I squinted through my scope and saw clearly it was a person, a young woman in a bright red jacket, the kind of high-visibility clothing hunters were to avoid being accidentally shot. But the way she moved was odd, stumbling and slow, almost dazed. I felt worried, wondering if she might be injured or lost. I climbed down and moved toward her, calling out softly to avoid startling her. When I reached the spot where she had been, she was gone. Even stranger, I couldn't find any footprints or broken twigs. No sign anyone had passed through at all. I circled the area, completely baffled, before finally climbing back into my stand. About 20 minutes later, I saw her again. Same bright red jacket, same lost, wandering look, but this time in the opposite direction. I called out louder, telling her to stay put, that I was coming to help. Again, when I arrived at the spot, she had vanished without a trace. That night, I mentioned what I'd seen to Jason. He suggested my eyes might have been playing tricks on me, or maybe it was just trespassers who fled when they heard me approaching. That made some sense, but it didn't explain the complete absence of tracks in the soft forest floor. The following weekend, Jason and I hunted together, staying close enough to remain within shouting distance. After about an hour, I saw the woman again. Same red coat, same slow movement through the trees. I waved frantically to Jason, who nodded in acknowledgement. We weren't hallucinating, he was seeing her too. We quietly approached from opposite directions, planning to intercept her, but again found nothing. We searched carefully for any evidence of her passing, broken twigs, disturbed leaves, footprints, but came up empty-handed. Maybe it really is a ghost. Jason laughed nervously, but I could tell he was as unsettled as I was. After that, we started hearing stories from others in the area. Apparently, we weren't the first to glimpse her. Local hunters had occasionally seen a lone figure in a red jacket moving silently through the woods, always seemingly disappearing when approached. Some people suggested it might be connected to a missing persons case from decades ago. In 1976, a young woman named Emily Sheridan had wandered off a nearby trailhead while hiking. Despite extensive searches, she was never found. The red jacket my brother and I saw matched the description of what she had been wearing when she disappeared. One cold morning a few weeks later, I was walking alone to my hunting spot when she appeared directly in front of me, not 50 feet away. This time, I could see her clearly. She looked young, barely 20, dressed lightly for the autumn weather in jeans and that bright red jacket. Her face seemed expressionless, pale, like she didn't even notice the cold. I took a step forward and spoke to her softly, trying to get her attention. She didn't respond or even look my way. Instead, she turned slowly and walked behind a large oak tree. I hurried forward, certain I'd find her on the other side, but there was nothing. I circled the tree several times, looking for any sign of where she might have gone, but it was physically impossible for her to have disappeared so completely in the seconds it took me to reach the tree. This shook me deeply. I began to avoid that section of the woods. I never felt threatened by her presence, but the uncertainty of seeing someone who couldn't possibly be there unsettled me profoundly. I researched Emily Sheridan's disappearance at the county library, reading through old newspaper articles. The details matched too closely to be coincidence. The age, the red jacket, and most disturbingly, the area where she was last seen was the same part of the forest where we kept encountering our mysterious figure. Last fall, near the anniversary of her disappearance, I decided to go back. I brought flowers and placed them at the base of that oak tree where I'd last seen her. I don't know if it was my imagination, but as I turned to leave, I felt a cold spot in the air and caught a glimpse of red out of the corner of my eye. The Allegheny Mountains have a long history of strange occurrences. The indigenous peoples who lived here before European settlement believed the mountains held powerful spirits. Early settlers recorded tales of spectral figures that would lead travelers astray. I wonder if Emily Sheridan is still out there, caught between worlds, perhaps not even realizing she's dead, endlessly wandering the woods where she took her last steps, appearing to those who might understand her plight. When I do go back to hunt in that area now, I always leave a small token, a flower or stone, by that oak tree. Maybe it's superstition, or maybe it's acknowledgement that some mysteries in these mountains will never be solved. Have you ever encountered something you simply couldn't explain away? A presence that defies logic but feels undeniably real? And if you did, would you run from it? Or try to understand what message it might be trying to share with you from beyond? Taken by the unseen. What if I told you that there are forces in these mountains that cannot be seen but are powerful enough to snatch a grown man from right before your eyes? Would you believe me if I said I witnessed it happen, helpless to stop it? This is the burden I've carried for 20 years, a truth so unbelievable that I've kept it locked away until now. When I was 10 years old, my family owned a small hunting cabin deep in the woods of northern Georgia. where the Appalachian Trail begins its long journey north. It was our weekend getaway, a place my father and his brother, my Uncle Jim, had built themselves when they were young men. Some of my happiest memories came from those weekends when my cousins Michael and Thomas would join us, and we'd spend hours exploring, playing hide and seek, and building forts in the surrounding forest. The cabin was rustic, wood walls, a stone fireplace, and the permanent smell of cedar, old wool blankets, and smoky logs. Our families had traditions rooted deeply in that place. Each autumn, during deer season, our fathers would prepare meticulously for their hunts, sharpening knives, cleaning rifles, laying out heavy hunting clothes the night before. My mother and aunt would cook hearty meals, and we kids would gather around the fireplace to hear stories about the woods. It was magical until the year everything changed. One afternoon, our dads had gone hunting just after lunch, dressed in their camo and blaze orange vests, promising to return before sundown. My cousins and I spent the day as we always did, running free, inventing endless ways to amuse ourselves. As evening approached, we started a game of hide and seek. I remember hiding behind the old woodshed, holding my breath, when I heard footsteps crunching slowly through leaves. Thinking someone had found me, I peered around the corner only to see my father walking alone from the woods. I shouted to greet him, immediately asking where Uncle Jim was. But Dad didn't respond. He didn't even look at me. His face was frighteningly blank, eyes staring straight ahead as he continued walking. I'd never seen him like that before, and it filled me with dread. We all rushed inside after him, questions spilling from our mouths, but he brushed past us without a word and collapsed heavily into a chair at the kitchen table. My mother and aunt immediately saw his distress and sent us kids upstairs. We didn't argue, but huddled at the top of the staircase, straining to hear. We caught only fragments of the conversation, but what came through were my father's haunted words: vanished, screaming, searched for hours. Soon after, we saw headlights through the windows. The local sheriff arrived, and a search party formed. For days, dozens of people combed through those woods, calling my uncle's name. They never found him, not a shred of clothing, not a drop of blood, not a single clue. My father refused to speak about what happened, even to his family. For a time, I wondered terrible things. Had they argued? Had my father somehow hurt his own brother? But they had loved each other deeply. There was no motive, no reason. The cabin, once our happiest place, became haunted by absence. We visited less frequently and eventually sold it. We even moved out of state. I think my father needed distance from the memories. Several years later, when I was a teenager, my father had too much to drink one evening. With liquid courage loosening his tongue, I managed to get him to open up about the incident. His voice trembled as he finally shared the truth he'd been carrying alone. He described tracking a deer with my uncle. The woods were quiet and familiar until suddenly, Uncle Jim stopped mid-step, eyes going wide. He appeared to be staring at something in the distance. My father asked what he saw, but before my uncle could answer, he let out a scream and was violently thrown to the ground by something my father couldn't see. Dad lunged forward to help, even fired his rifle wildly into empty air, but nothing struck the unseen target. My uncle was dragged, kicking and screaming, through the woods. Dad chased after him, firing until his ammunition ran dry, but there was nothing visible for him to shoot at. My uncle's screams faded into silence, and my father spent hours searching desperately, shouting his name until his voice gave out. But he found nothing. No blood, no tracks, not even signs of struggle. It was as if my uncle had simply been erased from existence. The sheriff, the townspeople, even our family questioned my father repeatedly, suspicious of his story. But what else could he say? He'd seen his brother vanish at the hands of some invisible force. He knew no one would believe that part, so he kept it to himself, carrying the guilt of being unable to save his brother, and perhaps the additional burden of being thought responsible by some. Uncle Jim's case remains unsolved. My father passed away 5 years ago, taking the full weight of that day to his grave. But I know what he told me that night wasn't a lie or a delusion. My father was many things, but never a liar. The Appalachian Mountains are ancient and mysterious. The Cherokee have legends of invisible spirits that hunt in these forests. Early settlers spoke of people being taken if they strayed too far from safety. What if these weren't just stories meant to keep children close to home? What if they were warnings based on truth? I returned to those Georgian foothills last year, staying in a rental cabin not far from our old family place. I hiked familiar trails and stood in clearings where my uncle and I had once played. I wanted closure, perhaps, or understanding. On my last evening there, as dusk settled over the mountains, I heard something moving through the underbrush. Not the familiar rustle of deer or raccoon, but something deliberate, something that seemed to circle around me, though I could see nothing there. I left immediately, feeling watched the entire drive back to the cabin. That night, I swear I heard my uncle's voice calling my name from the darkness beyond my window. I didn't answer. I didn't look. Some forces in these mountains are better left undisturbed. Some entities better left unchallenged. Whatever took my uncle that day is still out there, still hunting, and it knows our family. Have you ever felt something watching you from the woods? Something just beyond your vision that sets your instincts screaming? I hope for your sake that's all it ever does. Watch. Because some who have seen what lies beyond the veil of our ordinary world never return to tell about it. Thank you so much for joining me for this collection of terrifying encounters from the Appalachian Mountains. If taken by the unseen, sent chills down your spine, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to Dark Tales Vault. Your support means everything as I work toward my first 100 subscribers. There are countless more stories waiting to be told from America's most ancient and mysterious mountain range. Remember, in the oldest forests, we are never truly alone, and sometimes what we can't see is what we should fear the most.